So that I should probably say that this isn't part of my official work. This is a sort of bit of a side interest I have, and it's a kind of revisiting of a talk I did at Mozfest last year that was a slightly more practical workshop. So I'm going to give you the same first half of the talk I did at Mozfest, and then instead of doing the workshop bit, we're going to talk about the results of the workshop. I think they're quite interesting. So it's kind of half history lesson and half interesting stuff we found out in a room full of people last year. It's not going to be in French, which is you'll be relieved to know. This is a poster that the people I'm going to tell you about posted up around Paris in the kind of early 60s, this is what it means. It was a kind of provocation, and I normally leave that up there before I start, so people go, what on earth does this mean? And then we talk about it. But I want to talk to you about the Situationist International, who are a group of people from Paris in the 60s, so I think I have a lot of interesting stuff to say about things going on with technology today. Paris in May 1968, you will have heard of the Paris Riots, which is part of a kind of widespread load of unrest around the world. There was riots in Prague, there was the protests against the Vietnam War in the US. The Paris riots were kind of very spontaneous. They was described as a spontaneous eruption of rebellious spirits. One of the interesting things is there was no kind of concrete set of demands to this. There was kind of the Prague riots and things going on in the US at the time. They were quite tightly focused, and the Paris riots were generally this kind of reaction against authority and the status quo and this sort of general malaise. And there was this very kind of diffuse set of people who were all protesting at the same time. It was diverse, it was decentralized, and it was this sort of expression of this sort of passions rather than of any political position specifically. So it was a protest against boredom and malaise in general, rather than the protest against kind of any specific cause of this malaise. In the middle of it, there was this fellow called Guy Debord, who's over there on the right in the glasses, and he was part of a loosely federated group of artists, activists, and general pranksters who'd kind of coalesced about 11 years beforehand and begun working together. They called themselves the Situationist International, and they published this sort of early zine journal type thing about their thought. They were partly a school of political thought, partly an artistic movement, and partly just this sort of gang of people out to cause trouble, which makes them quite interesting because you can't separate these three aspects of the stuff they did out very easily. They were just kind of, all of this stuff is very important. And so I want to talk a little bit about kind of what their beliefs were, the types of things they did, because I think it's very interesting within the context of a bunch of stuff going on the internet today. So this is a quote from the Report on the Construction of Situations, which is the sort of Situationist manifesto. So they start out by saying, first, we believe the world must be changed. They don't necessarily talk about what change that is, but they talk about the most liberatory possible change of the society and the life in which we find ourselves confined. So they're very, very interested in the idea of kind of maximum liberty, maximum kind of freedom from constraint, the ability to exercise agency and individuality. They're also a very, very, very pro-technology movement. They were pro-technology, pro-progress. They were not concerned with rolling back kind of technological advances to a simpler time. They weren't Luddites. And they were interested in the possibilities that technology affords. The main kind of aspect of situationist thought was that the progress of technology had become a sort of absurdity in its place in modern life. In the face of increasing productivity that came from advances in technology, they argued that human labour was becoming more and more trivial because machines were doing more and more stuff. Yet we were continuing to spend the vast majority of our time on working. So they looked at this situation and went, "This is absolutely absurd. Our work, which takes up our entire majority of our existence, is becoming less and less important, and this is leading to this this situation in which we're spending our lives on trivialities." What becomes really interesting is they didn't necessarily just mean work in terms of kind of waged labour. They had a whole argument, a whole bunch of the way people lived in modern society kind of was a form of work, and that leisure activities are a form of work. It was a type of a type of work which was there in order to mask the fact that people's kind of creativity and freedom and intellectual curiosity was being depleted by this kind of by the society in which we lived. So they gave a name to these leisure activities which were there as a kind of emotional work to stop you thinking about your place in society. They call it the spectacle. And the spectacle is, in Guy Debord's Society of Spectacle, he defines it as the process by which all that once was directly lived has become mere representation. And we'll come back to this in a second. This is from the book, The Society of the Spectacle, which is a short book which sets out a bunch of these ideas. So he claimed that, I'll have to read through this because it's a bit wordy, I'm sorry. So just as early industrial capitalism moved the focus of existence from being to having, post-industrial culture has moved that focus from having to appearing. So the idea is kind of manufacturing and industrial society made us more concerned with possessions over things we actually are. The next stage in this development was to stop worrying about like possession of things, but to worry about how we appear in the eyes of other people. He went on to say that the spectacle is the sun that never sets over the empire of modern passivity. And I think a lot of this critique is quite relevant to a lot of things we're dealing with today. So this sort of acceleration of technological progress that is kind of eating up jobs that people once valued and felt they were doing worthy things. This is a thing that's going on today. These technology-led productivity gains are increasing. Like, we now have whole industries that people used to do are now starting to look a little bit like they're not necessary, so we have the same set of conditions. This idea of passivity and leisure activities that lead us to be passive consumers of things. This is one of our kind of top leisure times. I don't want to single out these two friends of mine in particular, but the endless scrolling timelines through kind of banality of stuff is a thing I think we can return to now and start and kind of consider pertinent. And finally, that focus on appearance over essence or over anything else. This is another kind of very modern kind of malaise, like looking at the kind of like influencer marketing culture and the way in which people kind of construct views of their own lives as a thing to be perceived rather than a thing to be enjoyed. A lot of this stuff is really relevant, and I think there's one example in particular that I think kind of brings all these three things together, and that's the Snapchat filter. So like this idea that I don't know where to start with this. So they're kind of passive. You don't have any kind of creative input in the thing that gets put on your face. There's no creativity involved. It's a thing that's given to you. They're very appearance focused. They're there to be seen by other people rather than yourself. And often they're these kind of branding vehicles. So this is some kind of like Halloween themed soap advert, I think. And this is what our social lives and our leisure activities are sort of being turned into. And a lot of this sounds so much like the things that a bunch of very angry people in France in the 60s were talking about. So I think it's quite interesting. So here we go. The struggle continues. I think this is a bit of a depressing prospect, and we've got a kind of more well-known French way of saying that. You can say plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Everything that changes is the same thing. But I think there's a lot we can learn about from the way in which Guy Debord and the Situationists kind of responded to the malaise in their own time that we can apply to the kind of the malaise in our own, if you like. So, getting back onto architecture, and with a slightly weirder view of architecture perhaps, because I'm not going to talk about any actual buildings, but this is a really great kind of series of things, and this is probably by design, because one of the interesting things about this Situationist International is they were very, very concerned with the ideas of cities and the ideas of cities as spaces people live in, and the effects of the architecture of the city and the design of the city upon the people who live within it. So exactly like the stuff Dora was saying earlier about the way in which having shared space, the way in which access of cars changes people's behaviour. This was the stuff that was being discussed in the 60s by these guys. So here's a quote from a guy called Raoul Venetian, who is another early situationist. So this gets to the heart of their relationship. So I think earlier on we were talking about the kind of positive affordances of urbanism and architecture and the design of cities. Raoul Venetian was a little bit more cynical, I think it's fair to say. So he argued that the city basically functioned as what we call today, you might have heard the term disciplinary architecture or architecture of control. Things like kind of home spikes that stop people sleeping in doorways and benches with that stop you loitering for too long because you went to go somewhere else. So they were very concerned with the idea that the city kind of had these affordances that encouraged you to act in a certain way, and that a lot of these affordances were negative. The geometry of our living environment affects and constrains our behaviour, as we've, I think, seen earlier on. So old Guy Debord also had a lot to say about this. So he talked about urbanism as the kind of design of the urban environment being the seizure by capitalism of the natural and human environment. So, and that the kind of design of cities and the design of these kind of constraining architectures was a development that led to sort of absolute dominion over humanity as a thing to be enjoyed. So I guess the difference here with some of the stuff earlier on is we've talked about kind of positive interventions into the design of cities that might be useful to people, and I think the situationist view was that the sort of anarchic one, that top-down control in general is a sort of bad idea, and that people should be able to make the city after what they particularly want. So we've talked a lot about kind of real life spaces and the politics of real life spaces, but I think we're quite familiar with the idea that people talk about our online life as being a space. We have this lovely kind of late 90s, early 2000s kind of aesthetic of cyberspace, and the kind of we've talked in metaphors of space about our kind of digital lives for ages. So the thing I'm very interested in is to look at some of the kind of critique that we got from the situationist critique of the city, some of their techniques for kind of responding to the things they found, and then applying that to the way we live online. So the question is, there's a sort of correspondence there, I think, between things that are going on online, things that are going on in the 60s in Paris. There's some kind of metaphors we can use to go, hey, these things look kind of similar, but I don't know, does it actually teach us anything useful? And I think it does, and we'll find out. So let's go back to the Situationists for a second. Their name for this sort of critique of the urban environment was psychogeography, and it wasn't just a set of critiques or a set of ideas about how cities work. It was a set of actual strategies for sort of getting involved in your environment and exploring it and understanding it better and trying to change it after your own purposes. So they defined it as the study of the specific effects of the geographical environment on the emotions and behaviour in individuals. And they proposed a bunch of kind of very practical ways of going about investigating this sort of thing. And there's one in particular which is of interest, which they called the Dérive. So this, in French, means drifting. The way it was defined is it's a technique of rapid passage through varied ambiances. So it's a posh word for exploring, basically, and exploring in a way that's not directed towards any kind of goal, that's just exploring for its own sake. You're choosing to be deliberately playful and deliberately aware of the effects of your surroundings on yourself as you wander around. So the situations would going up, they'd take a notebook and they'd kind of decide to meet somewhere in Paris, just go off wandering, maybe end up in a bar somewhere, I don't know, but they would go off wandering, taking notes on the stuff they saw, and they used this as a way of taking note of how the city was kind of affecting their behaviour. So one of the key things here was you went to drop your motives for movement and action, so step away from your usual reasons to go and do something. So whether that's, I would normally be going to work, I would be going to meet this person, I'm hungry and I'm going to get some food. You would suspend any reason you have for going and doing something and just move and see where you end up. So you let yourself be drawn by the attractions of the terrain and the encounters you find there. So it's pure exploration for its own sake. The aim of this is to identify the aspects of your environment which kind of push you in these different directions or pull you in certain ways, and to think about what kind of forces are acting on you as you drift around. It's a tricky thing to do because it involves disrupting all our own habitual behaviour, because we need to drop all our incentives and work out and just sit and be kind of present and see what happens. So I was trying to have a think about how we could use this, how we could take some of this these techniques and apply them to how we browse the web and how we move around online. So we did a workshop at Mozfest with a bunch of people, where we tried to take this idea of a Dérive and apply it to web browsing, and to use that to learn a little bit about the politics of online life and the way in which power and control plays out in unexpected ways. So let's get into that one. In order to kind of break down these kind of habitual behaviours of looking for things that we know we need, and to try and create conditions where we can just observe what's going on, we looked for a way of allowing people to be informed by stuff they wouldn't otherwise do. And there's another slightly separate idea, but a kind of situationist in spirit idea that we borrowed for this, and it's, has anyone seen these before? Brian Eno's oblique strategy cards. Brian Eno's a very famous record producer and musician, and he was in Roxy Music, and he produced a bunch of stuff on his own. He's one of the sort of first electronic musicians, and he came up with this deck of cards for dealing with creative blocks. They're called oblique strategies, and he calls them worthwhile dilemmas for creative practice. So they have a bunch of things. You shuffle them, and you go, I don't really know what I'm doing with this thing I'm doing, be it a bit of music, some sort of creative activity. I've kind of reached an impasse. What do I do? And you shuffle the cards, and you take one out, and it says something very abstract, and like, find the least, what's my favourite one? It's something like, find the least significant thing and bring it to the fore. And then it's up to you to interpret that and work out what it means, see what happens, and it's an idea, it's a way of breaking out of your kind of habitual ways of acting. So we made a bunch of these for guiding people around the web. So we had a bunch of starting points, so things you might go and look for online, so to sort of drop your motivations, in the words of Guy Debord earlier on. So rather than going, I'm at Mozfest, I might want to look up the programs for Mozfest, or I'm hungry, let me see what lunch I can get nearby, we gave people a specific, completely random and open-ended and sort of interpretable thing to go off and explore online. And again, in the spirit of Brian Eno, when they got stuck, we had a set of kind of strategy cards to break you out of ruts when you come across a point where you're not sure what choice to take next. So we made a deck of these and a deck of the ones, and then we got people in groups of 3 and 4 and just set them out web browsing and drawing maps of what they found. So we did a bunch of these activities. We did half an hour of kind of just sort of open-ended exploration. So you would go, I'm going to go and look for some news, and I'm going to just see what happens if I just follow the kind of path of least resistance as I move around online, and if I get stuck, I will draw one of these blue cards and see what happens then. So we took notes, drew maps, and then all came together to kind of work out what we'd learned, and I think the results were quite interesting. So a few things that this group of us hadn't kind of considered, that we found out after spending half an hour of kind of unfocused wandering around online, was the kind of knock-on effects of your choice of search engines seem like there's this alarmingly weird thing where if you start a sort of information-seeking task with Google, even if coming off the search engine result page and then browsing through other stuff, you end up at a sort of commercial imperative far quicker than with DuckDuckGo. And it's not just that Google sends you straight to pages that demand the exchange of money. It's a sort of weirdly emergent thing. If you start plotting, I searched for a certain thing on DuckDuckGo and a certain thing on Google, in most cases we saw, you would end up kind of in the world of commerce earlier on. So there's this sort of, the search engines kind of do function as these sort of gatekeeper in ways we don't quite understand, and it's not just about what they're showing you and not showing you on the search engine result pages. It's about the point at which they land you in other sites, and which kind of parts of the web you end up in. So there's some really fundamental stuff about how search in particular shapes our behaviour that I don't think any of us had kind of considered before. The second thing, so like at least 4 out of the 6 groups spent about 10 minutes desperately trying to escape a site that they had landed in through clicking on hyperlinks, because the kind of social vision of hypermedia linking out to relevant things elsewhere has died, and I don't understand how. Like, you can end up on a news site or end up somewhere else, no one outlinks to anything else at all. And when you start kind of plotting this out on a map, you start seeing these weird little islands of kind of traffic coming from platforms, so social media platform search, going into people who are terrified of linking out to each other. So we can start seeing how a bunch of kind of behaviours and a bunch of things we're worried about online, the sort of quote-unquote filter bubble problem and a bunch of other stuff, comes from this kind of this topology of how things link to each other and people's behaviour in publishing stuff. The final thing we noticed is a lot of the stuff that was most useful was hidden. There's a style of writing, there's the sort of inverted pyramid journalistic thing, but then very often on non-journalistic sites, on kind of things that were more functional, kind of more transactional, a lot of the most pertinent information was often in the kind of small print at the bottom, and that the kind of headline stuff was this essentially sort of advertising copy. And if you go looking for, like, one of the classic examples is these kind of listicle things that are written in order to get to the top of Google results for, say, something like bars to go to near Liverpool Street, and then you get there and you go, well, we're going to tell you all about the best bars to go to near Liverpool Street. If you're looking for bars near Liverpool Street, this is the site for you, and you get through everything. And then down the bottom there is maybe a list. So this was kind of interesting stuff. Like, that one is maybe more obvious than the others, but there was a bunch of stuff here that we started noticing happening consistently that I don't think we would have done if we hadn't spent this time just kind of speculatively exploring, which kind of focused our mind on thinking about these kind of relationships between things. So this is all kind of bleak. I've gone, look, the internet's rubbish and everyone's broken everything, and it's rubbish. But the nice thing about this strategy is it kind of draws attention to this. So once you understand these currents and these kind of these structures and the way they inform you, it's very easy to then kind of acknowledge them and start thinking about ways of resisting them. And I guess that's a sort of politically charged term, but it's a sort of useful user-centered thing. As someone who wants to go and find things online, I can now deploy various strategies in order to get to the things I'm looking for more easily. And it's both an act of kind of political resistance and one of just kind of pragmatically making use of things in a way that's useful to me. So a few strategies that came out of this, using more than one tool for the same job, and I'm talking about the search engines here in particular, but this kind of generalizes to a bunch of other things. So we did a bunch of experiments looking at the same page in different browsers, or in a browser that had my history in it and one that I don't normally use, or that has a different locale set, and you start seeing that you are offered different options and different bits of information that may have been may be more or less useful. So this idea that one can kind of shift your perspective on the same thing and then discover something different about it is useful, A, if you're having trouble finding where you want to go, but B, as a way of understanding the kind of mechanisms that are operating that are invisible that you can't necessarily see as a user. Another interesting thing someone else came up with as a strategy for dealing with a lack of kind of hyperlinks and things, they got very into copy and pasting text from one article, searching for it and seeing where else it shows up, and it was a way of kind of hacking around the fact that everyone was being very antisocial in linking to sources. And it's a really, really useful thing if you want to understand provenance of a bit of information you're being told, or who has put it there, what their incentives are. Kind of looking at the thing you see in front of you and seeing where else it occurs is a very good way of understanding how that information has kind of travelled around online. And finally, kind of being willfully stubborn about looking at things you're probably not meant to, or that no one wants you to. So looking into small print, looking at the bottom of the page first to see if perhaps that's where the information you've been looking for is hidden, often gets you places quicker than you could otherwise, and it also kind of teaches you a lot about what other people's incentives, what the incentives of publishers, other people, the platforms, people you're dealing with are, because the stuff like, another good example of this is the Facebook download your data thing, which is buried, like it's absolutely astonishing. It's somewhere in a help page, but you go to the bottom of the help page and then somewhere alongside a bit of something that looks kind of like the layout furniture is this additional link that's like, here's the download thing. So a lot of the really significant stuff tends to be hidden hidden behind something. So there's interesting things to be found if you go and look in the wrong places, I guess. So I guess this is all a bit vague, and I kind of want to sum up why I think this is interesting. So the first thing that I think is very important is this type of exploration teaches a kind of very general thing that I believe, that aimlessness can be a really good thing. We kind of, passivity is kind of bad, but not having a specific goal in mind is often a very good way of learning about things, and a lot of kind of discourse about what to do around, so this probably is a work thing, and don't tell anyone this. When you ask anyone at my work about what we do about how people spending too much time on social media, they go, well, we give them something worthy to do, like learning a language or going out to the gym more. And I kind of believe very passionately that having time to be idle and be aimless can be just as educational and just as important. So I'm hoping this is a sort of, this technique is a sort of, hopefully a kind of validation of this idea that being passive, not such a good thing, but not having a specific goal in mind is often a very, very valuable way of learning about the world around you. The second thing is this kind of situational awareness, this looking at things around you and being aware of stuff is not just about the real environment, and there are ways of kind of critically engaging with kind of say it again, online space in the same way that you might do with the urban environment, and thinking about the effects it has on you. And finally, it's kind of fun. It's like going down Wikipedia rabbit holes and going through TV tropes and stuff. Like there's a lot of joy that can be got through just kind of this general exploration of the world around you that I think shouldn't be lost. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
I guess it's more of a point than a question. I guess listening to you talk about the situation, it sounded exactly like the plot to WALL-E.
Yes, yeah, a little bit. Yeah, that's interesting with the people in the chairs and stuff like this.
Yeah, the illusion of doing something is I'm going to play virtual golf, or I'm told now I need to drink the blue product, not the red product.
Yeah, right, and that's a very spectacular thing, and I think this is this is another kind of really good metaphor. Like if you look at say the way things like so Amazon, I think, is a very good example of this, because Amazon is sort of involved in lots of facets of your everyday life. If you have Amazon Prime, they're providing kind of entertainment to you. They're also providing, soon at some point, groceries. And you start, I think that becomes a very pertinent kind of bit of slightly dystopian futuristic fiction, because we know that things like recommender systems, things like what's shown you, are there to optimize for the amount of time you spend watching. If you, the way your kind of picks on Amazon are shown to you, they're making a bet that they can make you spend more time in front of Amazon Prime than you otherwise would. So there's very specific social effects that come from this, and it is exactly that kind of, like, maybe it's a slightly exaggerated dystopian thing, but I don't think it's unreasonable to say that this is how a lot of things that do have an effect in our lives are organised. They're there to sort of to nudge us in a certain direction for someone else's benefit. Loyalty cards, yeah, exactly. Yeah, like there's no. I mean, I like that. God, there's a whole lot of fascinating stuff about supermarkets. I've got a friend who knows a lot about this, but they have kind of brownish tinted glass often, or used to in the 80s, and there was this whole kind of theory that you wanted to make it look really gloomy outside, so people felt like staying longer in the supermarket than than they otherwise would. But yeah, there's all this sort of subtle coercion going on, and it is exactly that is exactly the end of it. And it's, being aware of these things going on is kind of fascinating in its own sense, and also a good way of just being aware of how things are, how the world affects you, I guess.